that go beyond just natural gas. And tonight he's going to tell us about renewable energy leases, like wind and solar and so forth, and what our landowners are going to need to be aware of if they're approached to lease their land for a renewable energy system. So with that, please give Jim a warm welcome while I set up. Yeah, hi Dan.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention is that the DLC actually, this is what kind of got some of this started. I was approached by one of the companies to have them come and speak to the joint landowners about leasing landowners' land. And I'll tell you, it's one of the things that, getting into it, starting to look into it, it was really concerning. It was really concerning. Not very much money at all. Kind of lies right from the start. These guys were worse than gas landmen, and their leases are worse than gas leases. Some of the things that were a big concern is the taxes, and I think Jim will be talking about that. I don't want to take the thunder out of what he's going to cover. Him and I kind of went over some of it, but I was really concerned when I started hearing this. I thought landowners are going to need to know, because a lot of people are going to be desperate. They're going to say, well, gee, I didn't get the gas, I got to do something. These are 15-acre lots they're looking for. And then they lied to me. They said it was a 25-year lease, but they didn't mention that there's a 5-year production part to that before the 25 years even starts, and you don't get paid almost nothing for that 5 years. There's a lot to it, a real lot to it.
Anything left to say now?
Yeah, there's a lot more to say.
The easy thing is to remember is just don't sign it.
Where are those automatic applicators?
I'm sorry? Oh. Okay, I'm going to start out explaining how I got into wind. Everybody knows I got 1 foot in natural gas, but I'm kind of unusual. I also have a foot in alternative energies, which haven't been able to get anywhere in New York State. That's another long story I'm going to get into. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, before I get into the leases and so forth, I'm going to talk about this plan that you guys have probably all heard about, the Jacobson plan. This is what the antis have been touting as a reason that we don't need to develop natural gas. Well, this was put together by Jacobson from Stanford, Cornell, UC Davis, and a bunch of other guys, and I'm going to tear this thing apart tonight. Pretty easy to do, actually. Actually, my career in wind started with this. This was built back in 1941. I wasn't born then, but I had heard about it when I was going to school at SUNY Albany, and at the time it was the biggest windmill in the world. It's 175 feet across, 1.25 megawatts. It was a monster, and it's on a place called Grandpa's Knob near Rutland, Vermont. And me and my buddies, we were looking for something to do. It was in the winter of '77, and somehow I talked them into following me up, and unfortunately there was a lot of snow. And you ever walk in that snow where you're down to your crotch and your feet still aren't touching the ground? That's what it was like. Yeah, it was just god awful. But when we got up there, we found one of the blades sticking up out of the snow, which was astounding. This thing lasted until March of 1945, and there was a fellow that was working up in the nacelle, and it had to be manned all the time. And in the middle of the night, vicious storm, one of the blades broke off and flew down the mountainside. This guy is stuck up there with a very unbalanced wind turbine. He had to jump over a 24-inch wide diameter shaft to get to the shut-off switch to shut the thing down. He just barely survived. But it's interesting that everything is all gone now. The only thing that's there is some concrete and some steel pillars that are sticking up. But that's what got me interested in wind, so I'm kind of following it along. This report that I was just talking about came out, and I looked at it. This is a summary, and I looked at the first thing, and I'll talk about that a little bit further, but as soon as I saw that, I just threw it on the floor. I said, these guys, I mean, they're coneheads or something. I don't know what's going on, but they have no idea what they're talking about. And I'll go through this whole thing and just tear it apart. Very quickly, Bob and I were talking about this earlier tonight. I was curious, here's the sources of electricity in 2014, and I went back to the EIA for 2000 to compare. Here's coal, natural gas, here's your other renewables in total, and then they're broken out separately down here. But you can see there's some changes, but let me just put it in a graph form. In short, coal has decreased, Natural gas has increased. Nukes are about the same, hydros are about the same. The other renewables, you can see there is a big increase there, not a big, but it's a significant increase. That's all coming from wind. Back in 2000, we basically had zero wind to speak of, but now it's closing in on 4.5% of our total generation. So wind actually is making a difference. Solar, we'll see what happens with that. This is the first item I looked at, and what caught my eye, they were talking about 4,020 5-megawatt onshore wind turbines. And what caught my eye was the 5. I said, these guys have no idea what they're dealing with here. A 5-megawatt wind turbine is enormous. Here's a standard 1.5 meg. You guys have obviously seen all the utility scale turbines. First of all, before I go any further, how many of you think that they're ugly? Okay, how many think they're beautiful? Anybody? Yeah, hi, honey. My wife's in the back. There's not much in between. How many of you think they're noisy? Okay. How many of you have actually driven up to the bottom of one and actually listened to it? Vic, Bob, Michelle? The newer ones are definitely much different, especially if you go up to Wolf Island. I'll show you a picture in a second. I was near Altoona, and we did a tour, and they allowed us inside one of their turbines. This was a very, very windy day. Let me go back here. These blade tips were bent back about 25 feet on that day. It was so windy. But they were making a lot of electricity. This is the inside of what a turbine looks like. Most of them will have a ladder. This is a young man's game. Most of them have to climb up. This particular one had a little elevator, but that's a rarity in these turbines. Most of them, they've got to just sit there and just physically climb up the towers. This was interesting. This is in Vancouver, and it has an observation area. It's at the top of a ski resort. Michelle and I visited this back 2010, I think it was. And as we're going up, there's just a few that has a real elevator going up, but it's very small. And as we were getting in, the guy warned us. He says, the higher we go, you're going to feel it sway more and more and more. And sure enough, it did. As we got up to the top, we stepped out. Sure enough, it was going back and forth, but also the wind was gusting from different directions, so the turbine was constantly adjusting itself. So here we are, swaying back and forth, twisting like this, kind of getting woozy. And then I made the mistake of telling Michelle not to look down, which of course she did because she was standing on a glass floor. That was it for her. She said, get me down. She had had enough. The United States is the Saudi Arabia of wind. And this is the reason why right here. All that wind, we have incredible wind no other country has. But we have a problem. Nobody lives there.
I thought it was focused over Washington, D.C.
Well, true. There's a good source of wind over there. So we got all this wind, but how are you going to get it to the coast? That takes miles and miles and miles of transmission lines. That's very costly. It's just not very effective. Here, I went to the New York Farm Show for several years, and I had this sign up because I had 1 foot in gas for down here, but I also had the turbines up because if you get north of the thruway, all the farmers up there, they're all about the wind. They don't have any gas. That's all they have. So I got to ask you to do me a favor, do them a favor. All these guys up here, they're dependent on the wind. That's their only hope. It's like gas is our only hope here. That's their only hope. So I know a lot of guys kind of bash the wind, but there are cousins up there, and they need some help too. So if you kind of ease up on the wind bashing, if you would, it'd be helpful, at least to them. But here's the source of wind for New York. You can see it's very strong around the lakes, especially off Long Island. You have some good wind in here. You have the Cohocton. Everybody's been up 390. You've seen the Cohocton blades up there. Here's Louville. There's some turbines up in here, but most of them are in the Maple Ridge project. You have Fenner and a couple of others down here. I've worked trying to get projects up in here. You can forget about it. There's so much anti-wind up here because of the Wolf Island project. They tried to get projects up in Cape Vincent. BP finally pulled out. They said, no way. They tried to get turbines up here off Blue Island. They pulled out. No way. They tried to get turbines in the lake here. They pulled out. No way. They just gave up. It's not going to happen. Here's some problems. Here's a young kid. Most of this is great for the young kids because these things have lots of computers in them. Every time the blades go around, each of them are independent from each other. So as the blade goes up, it's catching more wind. It's stronger at the top than it is at the bottom. But each blade is independently adjusting every time it's going around. And so they need lots of computers. But the problem is the kids like the computers. They don't like the fact that they have to be tested and they have to be able to lower themselves from the nacelle in case of a fire or an emergency. So that's what they have to go through. So a lot of these kids will go to college with this job in mind, and then this day comes and suddenly they're looking for a different career. They just can't do it. This is the Altamont Wind Farm out in California. Every time I talk about turbines, everybody brings up the birds and the bats problem. The birds really is a very minor problem today. The average turbine kills maybe 1 to 2 birds per year, and that's it. But the bird issue started with this. And this farm started back in the 70s. You guys remember waiting in lines at the gas stations, you know, the odd and even days and so forth? That's when everybody wanted to do anything to get off from the oil, from the foreign oil. So they came up with the tax credits, and this was a big farm. There's almost 5,000 of these turbines, and it's all owned by one guy. It's on a ranch owned by one guy. The problem was, of course, they never gave a thought to the migratory paths. And they were using off-the-shelf equipment. They had to get these things up fast, so that's why they'd use standard trusses, and they had relatively small turbines, and it attracted the birds. You know, it gave them a place to rest, and so they were attracted to it. Well, it didn't take long for them to get, meet their maker. But that bird part of the bird and bat issue goes right back to these guys. Most of these are being torn down and replaced with newer turbines that have a solid base to them. Here's another problem, shadow flicker. Everybody talks about the noise, but really shadow flicker is probably more serious, because if you're in a house and you got a turbine down there and the sun is setting behind it, you're just going to get, shadow after shadow after shadow going through your room. It's extremely annoying. Another problem, of course, these things are getting so big, it's hard to get them down the roads. And this is just a standard 1.5 meg machine. There's nothing big about this anymore. This is fascinating. I'm glad you're here, Scott. This is an interesting story. I had this picture up, and one year I had a young farmer. He walked by and he stopped. He says, "That's my farm." I said, "Really? I'd like to talk to you." And he says, "Well, it used to be my farm. I sold it to an Amish guy." And he said he was in the process of signing a lease for the turbines. And he asked the Amish guy if he wanted the air rights. The Amish guy didn't understand what he was talking about. Of course, the Amish guy, he just wants to farm. He could care less about anything else. So the guy that was selling it kept the air rights. He gets all the money from these turbines. The Amish guy doesn't get anything. The following year, the Amish guy walked up and said, "That's my farm." He was not a happy camper. But what was interesting was it raised the question of air rights themselves. We have the gas rights are the dominant estate, and we're used to that. Where it controls the surface unless you put some restriction in the lease. But what about the air rights? Don't you have the same thing? I don't know if you ever ran into any of the air right issues, but the question I have is, well, if that's true, do the air rights, are they the dominant estate, so that the land, they have the right to control the surface to the degree that they need to, run wires or whatever they have to do? Yes, Vic?
I know in 1976, they passed a bill that gave federal aviation the air rights above your property. The only thing you own is the surface and below. Federal aviation in the United States owns it.
Yes, well, they've got,
That might be only for the sake of air transportation.
there may be some other,
Well,
That's the air
what generated
space.
the bill was
yeah,
airplanes crossing over your property. That's what generated the bill.
well,
But they did come up with a bill saying that
yeah.
to fix it.
Well, what's interesting is if you have air rights and they're dominant, and I've got a guy out in the western part of the state, he has both. He's got 2 turbines on his property, and he also has natural gas. And so the question I had for him is, well, which came first, and do you have any problems with the other? And he said, no, somehow they worked it out, so it never became an issue. But I just thought it was interesting. Okay, here is, we just went through, these are, let me back up. Okay, this guy is a 1.5 megawatt machine. Bob and I were talking about this too. Pennsylvania, as you're driving north on 81, you see turbines all over the place. Pennsylvania has over 700 turbines. Believe it or not, New York has more. We have over 1,000. Most of them are these, the 1.5 megawatts. They were the standard, especially by GE for a long time. Then, if you go up to Lowville, the Maple Ridge Farm, these are 1.65s. These are the biggest turbines in New York State, 1.65s. If you want to see something bigger, you can, and you can see it from New York State, but you have to go up to Cape Vincent. They're all on Wolf Island. And these are 2.3 megawatt turbines. The biggest one in the entire country is a single 2.5 megawatt turbine that you can see if you're driving on 90 heading up to Cleveland. The Lincoln Electric Plant, they put one up, it's a 2.5.
Good.
These are the biggest ones
Okay, great.
that you can see from New York, but they're in Canada. And you're looking at the only person, I'm not making this up, who has been officially forbidden by the Canadian government from looking at their turbines. It's a long story. I'll fill you in later.
You don't look like a terrorist.
No.
This is Jeff.
Uh,
Hey Jeff,
Yes.
so when you say 1.5 megawatts, is that per particular, how is that?
That's the maximum capacity. So if you got the maximum one hitting it, that will kick out 1.5 megawatt for over an hour, be 1.5 megawatt hours. Most of them don't hit that. The investors are typically looking and expecting about a third of the capacity, of the nameplate capacity. So when they're doing their financials, they're looking for figuring 500 kilowatts. But here's a 5 megawatt machine. And this is the reason why, when I saw that report, I threw it down. These guys have no idea what they're talking about. Look how tall this thing is. I mean, the nacelle itself is like 3 stories tall. Nobody's going to climb up there. These things are typically 300 feet from the ground up to the nacelle. The blades, coming back to a standard 1.5, they're about 230 feet in diameter. This guy is about 400 feet in diameter. Big difference. There's no way you can get these down our streets or under our bridges. You just can't do it. That's why they're only used offshore, with this exception. So they started out, they wanted 4,020 of these, 4,020 of them onshore. It's like, where are you going to put those? Because I've been working for years trying to get the little 1.5s up, and I can tell you, if you think the towns are banning fracking, you should go up north. You talk about trying to get a wind project going anymore, forget about it. It's ugly. It's uglier than the gas story, as far as I'm concerned. It's amazing.
Anti-air.
So they want 12,700 of these offshore. Well, I can tell you, where are they going to put them? Off Long Island? I don't think so. I don't think anybody down there. They just got the exemption, what is it, sales tax. Their yachts, if it's over $230,000, they don't have to pay sales tax above the $230,000. Are you kidding me? And now, are they going to be driving their yachts through 12,700 of those turbines? I don't think so. So here's an offshore 5 megawatt machine. Again, you can see how far these are spaced apart. They're spaced apart for a reason. I'll get to that in a minute. They're trying to see how big they can make these wind turbines. This is a design for a 20 megawatt turbine. They found out that if they went with the standard 3-blade concept, they ran into problems where materials won't hold up. They don't even have cranes that are big enough to install these things offshore. So this is another idea for a 20 megawatt system, and it was designed by a company in Ukraine. But to give you an idea, this is roughly 1,000 feet tall and 1,000 feet wide. They're monsters. Here are the next item on the list were these wave devices. Now, the way this works is a wave comes in, in between each section, they have hydraulic rams, and so as they're being forced, the rams will go back and forth and basically is powering a generator. Not exactly a smooth system, but it does work. This is an artist concept. You can see why they're called sea snakes. I get the creeps looking at them, but anyways, they're not very good. Geothermal plants, they threw this in there, 36 100 megawatt geothermal plants. Well, the biggest geothermal we have, correct me if you know of another one, is the geysers out in California. And the only reason that that's there is because they've got, they're close to a hot spot. Well, we don't have any hot spots here. All the rocks around here are old and cold. Here's our favorite. We're talking about hydroelectric plants. They wanted 6.6, 1,300 megawatt units. Those are pretty big. In fact, we only have one that's bigger than that.
Where are they gonna put the .6 dam?
Well, that's what I was,
Hard to hold
and where
water.
do you get the .6 thing, right? So here's the biggest one. This is the Robert Moses plant. These are the largest plants we have in the state. Here's your Moses, here's the Blenheim Gilboa pump storage, and then they drop off pretty quickly here. So right now, we have a total of 4,817 megawatts of hydro, and they're looking to get 8,500. Do they know of another Niagara River through New York State? I don't know where they're going to get that from. But
One of the plants also is a pump storage plant. So that only generates electricity sometimes.
sometimes, that's right, yeah. Daytime, yeah. Have you ever seen that? That's an interesting facility. So, it's just another, these things are just one pipe dream after another after another. Tidal turbines. This is a 1 megawatt tidal turbine. Now, where are they gonna put that? Hudson River? I don't know. I have no idea where they could put something like that. And they wanted to put 2,600 of these things. Can you see your electricity bills starting to climb a little bit here?
Now, this is all for the United States, not
New
just
York
for-
State.
This is just for New York State.
This is New York State. And
So
this-
they gotta do this 50 times over then for the nation, basically.
Well, they here's it for New York,
Give or
but
take.
what's interesting, they tried to cover everything, including heating, which is obviously significant, and transportation, and they're throwing in locomotives even, trucks, everything. They want everything on electric. And it's like, this is crazy. Oops. Then they wanted 5 kilowatt residential roof PV systems, the photovoltaic systems. Almost 5 million of them. I went to the 2010 census, there's about 8 million residences in the state. So you're basically talking about rooftop on just about every house that you can see. And then they, on top of that, they wanted a 100 kilowatt system on roughly 500,000 commercial and government roof systems. So you're putting solar literally on just about every rooftop you can find. This is where it gets really interesting. The solar PV plants, the photovoltaics. They wanted 828 50 megawatt units. Those are massive. This is the Snyder Road Farm. This is brand new. They just commissioned this. This is owned by Cornell. Here's the Ithaca Airport, Cayuga Lake, and you can see it takes up about 10 acres. It uses roughly 5 acres per megawatt, and that's really pushing it. Normally, they want more than that, especially up north. But the reason this land was available is kind of interesting, because right next door is the radiation burial ground for Cornell University. This is where they're burying all the stuff they had from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and nobody wants to be near it. So that's why this land seemed to be available. But you can see it takes up a lot of acreage, and you're only talking 2 megawatts. There's a close-up. You can see everything's uneven. It just simply follows the ground. So it's not really neat looking at all. And yes, I was up there in January, and they were half covered with snow.
Do those track the sun or are they fixed?
They just sit there. They don't track anything. They just, yeah. So when they're talking about getting 2 megawatts out of that, that's at high noon. Far less than that in the morning, of course, nothing at night.
Does the reflection bother the pilots?
Actually, no, because these things are designed to absorb the light. But you'll see something in a moment where it does bother the pilots. And these are the concentrated solar power plants. They wanted 387 100 megawatt CSP plants.
In New York.
In New York, yes. Here, we're gonna talk about the Ivanpah plant, which is located right on the border of Nevada and California, roughly around there. So they have ideal conditions. They have, great sunshine, good weather and all that. And they have 3 of these units where they have you've probably seen where they have mirrors reflecting all the sunlight onto these boilers. And the whole idea is very simple. You just boil the water, converts to steam. It'll get up to 800 degrees on each of these. There's one where it's been turned on. And you can see it's just massive. With the 3 of these, you're talking 4,000 acres for this one facility. And what's interesting is the investors are quite disappointed. They found out that, well, 2 things. One, efficiency-wise, let's go back to the PV for a second. Those panels, they're only about 15% efficient. They're not very efficient at all. This is probably half of that, because it takes twice as much acreage to get the same megawatts as you can with the solar panels.
What's the megawatt rating of one of these?
I think I have it on a slide coming up. Hold off on that, I think I've got that coming up.
Now, another neat thing about these is these units actually use natural gas at night to keep the stored water at a temperature so that in the morning when the sun comes up, the system can come back online quickly.
What's really interesting, they also use it during the day.
When it's cloudy.
They're finding out, it just came out in an investor report, these things are only producing half the power they expected.
This is the Google plant, right?
Google is a part of it, yeah, they're one of the 3 owners, yep. So it's very disappointing from a technological and from an economical point of view, and also from an environmental point of view. I mean, you want to put this in New York State, excuse me, but you just covered up 4,000 acres. Don't you think the environmentalists might have a little issue with, the bugs and bunnies?
A lot of trees cut down.
A lot of trees cut down.
And then
You're gonna take-
they won't let the pipeline go in to supply the gas they're gonna need to have.
We're coming to that. So here's their wish list, but what I thought was really interesting was the last item. They said somehow, magically, I forgot to bring my magic wand, magically, it will reduce the in-use power demand by about 37%. Where did that come from? They don't explain it. They just said, well, if we go to electricity, that alone is going to reduce our in-use by 37% with no explanation. It's like,
You're not gonna be able to afford it, so you're just gonna not use it.
well, I think we're going to see the temperature in our houses go down by 37%. That might be what's going to happen. Okay, now I took all this wish list that they had, and I said, okay, how much space are you going to need to do this little dream that they have? So I combined the on and offshore wind turbines. I'm assuming with the politics, they're never going to build anything out off Long Island, not with what they paid for their views from their McMansions and so forth. So I suspect they'll probably just push it up here. There's no place to build any of this stuff, any of the infrastructure down in New York City or Long Island. I mean, it's already built out. I mean, there's no room. So it has to be, guess where, upstate. So if you've got a combined total of 16,020 of these machines, what's interesting is they like to have a minimum of anywhere from 3 to 10 diameters apart. In other words, you've got a 5 megawatt turbine, 400 foot in diameter. The average they're really looking for is 5 or better. So you got 5 times 400 feet, you got 2,000 feet. So these big machines have to be 2,000 feet apart. And that's because of letting the wind regenerate the power. Otherwise, they're not going to have enough power. And investors are not going to pay for turbines that are
One
not
turbine
generating.
will cause a wind shadow on the other one.
Right. And so it takes a while for that to regroup. So it's a balancing act with the investors, how the numbers are working out. But a rough guide is 5x the diameters. Well, that means each turbine needs a space of about 2,000 by 2,000 feet. That works out to about 92 acres. Here's your total acres, 1.5 million acres. And you're going to have shadow flicker all over that thing. not to mention the noise and everything else. Although I have to say, the newer turbines, like when we were up at, on Wolf Island, the Canadian government did let me in eventually. But on Wolf Island, we were sitting there, you couldn't hear anything from the wind tips. Yes, Vic?
The shadow flicker should be a main point for these things, because of the amount of epileptics and
Oh.
people who suffer seizures
Absolutely,
in New York State. Those things will actually trigger
Yeah.
epileptic seizures,
absolutely.
and they don't take that into consideration.
Yeah, yeah. So you got the total acres. Take a look at this now. I had to go back and check my numbers like 15 times. I couldn't believe it. For all these turbines, you're talking 2,400 square miles. That's a lot of square miles, especially if it's all upstate, not downstate. Now you got the solar PV plants. You go through the same math, about 5 acres per megawatt. That's a minimum, especially upstate New York. Probably should have 7.5 to 10. So you're going through all this math here. That comes up with 323 square miles for that. What about the Bugs and Bunnies report on that one? Then you have the CSP plants. If they can never do those, you're talking 617 square miles because they're even less efficient than the photovoltaics. So then we have the issue of the right-of-way requirements. This became really interesting. They were talking about generating this much in megawatts, which of course would be generated upstate. You have 500, I chose 500 kV lines. The maximum, I just talked with Jerry Putman the other day, the biggest line NYSEG has is a 345 kV. But let's say we bump it up to a 500 kV, that can do a capacity of about 1 million megawatts. So you need 254 of these lines, doing the math, side by side. Each line needs 150 foot for right-of-way. You're coming up with a grand total of over 7 miles wide. Here's a picture in California. There's only 2 lines. They want to go 254? Are you kidding me? If you took, I did this math. Here's 5 megawatt wind turbines, 2,400 miles, with solar plants 323, CSP 617, and then I just took, let's say, half the population of states downstate. So let's say half of that power from half of this number, I did 3.6, and then I measured, I just threw a dart and said, let's say you start with Marathon, down in New York City, it's about 160 miles. You do all the math, you need 576 square miles. And they're giving them grief over the Constitution pipeline, which is what, 50 feet? Like, are you kidding me?
That number, your total number, that's essentially making a square.
That's assuming this was all
If
one.
we assume that this, it's a square shape, that one side of the square would run from New York to Syracuse, Syracuse over to Rochester, Rochester south, and then back over to Binghamton. You
What-
essentially have the whole center of the state
Well,
dedicated to
I
this.
did a little bit differently, which you'll see in just a second. But all this stuff does not include any of those wave devices, geothermal, hydroelectric, all this other stuff. But I took the square miles and I said, well, how many counties would that take? Of course, counties are all different sizes. And I went through it. Started out with Broome, Tioga, Chenango, Portland, Chemung, Schuyler, and I was very pleased I was able to find room for Tompkins County. I'm sure they would gladly be a part of this. Yes, Vic?
You're in the solar, or in the wind business, I guess, you are in the business.
I'm trying. I've never been able to get a successful project.
Let me ask you a question, have you ever thought about proposing to put a wind service in Cuba, Seneca Lake, in the lake itself? Just so that we can expose them for what they are?
Not there, but I did have a discussion with Joe Heath about Onondaga Lake. Because the Indians, that I understand, own the bottom of Onondaga Lake, which nobody seems to want to use for much of anything else right now. And I thought that'd be an interesting place to put some wind.
And Joe's response?
No response. Now, I can't talk about wind and solar without somebody sticking their hand up and telling me about the subsidies. I know all about the subsidies, but I gotta be honest on this one. If all, as a taxpayer, if all I had to pay was subsidies for wind and solar, I'd be thrilled. It's absolutely dwarfed by the money that's going for subsidizing the oil and gas industry. Here's just 3 examples. You got percentage depletion, 15% right off the bat. You don't have to pay tax on it. You don't get that with wind. You don't get that with solar. royalties on the Bureau of Land Management lands. You're talking, the BLM has leased 60 million acres of our property. Anybody want to take a guess what the royalty rate is? I mean, if you were in charge, what kind of a rate would you like that you think would be fair? 25%?
15?
I can tell you, it's 12.5. There's never been a lease more than 12.5. And it's a subsidy. That's all it is. It's a pure subsidy. Intangible drilling costs. This one is really interesting, especially for an accountant. It's hard to explain intangible drilling costs until you look at one of these. These offshore platforms, they can easily run close to $1 billion, and some of them are well over $1 billion, some of the big ones. What's interesting about it is that once they complete it, and they drill their first well, the moment that drill bit hits the sea floor, the operators can immediately deduct the entire cost of this all at once, except for the materials. So all your design costs, your labor costs to build this thing, transportation costs, everything else that went into that is written off immediately. You guys are in business, you got a farm, everything, you can't even write off your pickup truck that period of time. I mean, no other industry gets that kind of a goodie. So I'm just saying I understand why people are sore with wind and solar subsidies, but if you're going to worry about subsidies, it's our oil and gas friends that really are taking advantage of it. Okay, here's local wind and solar. You do have issues with these leases. I've got one over here that Bob gave me. You're right, it's a god-awful lease. As far as the wind, we have real problems. Around here, we're class 3 wind. It's not good enough. The investors aren't interested. We need class 4 or better, and even 4 is kind of marginal. If they can get better wind, obviously they're going to go for that. But the investors are just not interested around here. Of course, you have the regulatory environment. It's impossible to get hooked in with the electrical grid. Just because you put up turbines on your land doesn't mean you can run down to the nearest high tension line and tie in. It doesn't work like that. The other thing is, if you're the last one on, you're the first one off. So again, if you're an investor, you need to make sure you're going to get your money back from your investment. And if you're unsure, you're going to look for a much higher rate of return. Then here's the real problem, is the Irish mafia. There's a couple of companies, they're sister companies, literally they're out of Ireland, and I've run into both of them. They are notorious. This is even worse than the flipping that went on with the gas leases. This wind business, the Irish mafia, these guys are absolutely notorious for coming in with horrible leases and paying next to nothing. And they will lie to their mother to get their mother to sign one of these leases. They are god-awful. And I ran into them in Tioga County. We had some people called me up and asked me to come out, and I met these people. I didn't know who they were at the time. But they found out that I was advising them, and somehow they quickly pushed me out of the picture and wanted to talk one-on-one with them alone. Well, this family, they did have one of the very few spots that were perfect for a wind lease in our area. They had clear hillside, no trees. More importantly, they had a substation that was nearby, and even more important than that, they had an end user that would be willing to sign the power purchase agreement. Without a PPA, you're not going anywhere. But they had everything all lined up. It was perfect. And they knew it. So they signed them up. I found out after the fact, but they signed them up for $2,500 for a couple hundred acres. We're not talking $2,500 an acre. We're talking $2,500 for 10 years for the whole deal. And then, in the lease, it's for another $2,500, they can tie them up for another 10 years. And it's like, you did all that for a lousy $2,500? After a while, after a while, I just stopped feeling sorry for people. If they're willing to go ahead and do that without proper advice, hey, you're an adult. You're on your own. This is a company I've been working with. This is fascinating. There was a company called Renewables. It was founded by some farmers out in Minnesota, big-time farmers. They have lots and lots of acreage. They were tired of paying for their electrical rates, so they went out on their own and they actually bought one of these big utility scale turbines to use for their own use. They liked it so much they built 3 more. And then what they learned, they decided to take out and help other farmers around the country that wanted to do the same thing. The business grew so fast, they finally had to spin off Ecos Energy from Outland Renewables. What's interesting about it is the original farmers are still on the board, and they're still referred to as the founding farmers. And they are they've made a transition. They are not interested in wind anymore. They're going strictly solar for lots of reasons. One, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to get a solar project through a town than wind. You know, the visibility, the noise, and all that stuff drives people nuts. The solar is much easier to get through. So what was interesting, I was talking with Marguerite Wells. She's the lady that's trying to get the Black Oak project, and she's having a little trouble. It's a community wind project. You would think community wind, the local community is getting together to invest into a local project to generate electricity for their own consumption. You would think anywhere in the country where it would be successful would be Ithaca. She needs to raise $40 million in cash. She's raised 2. That project isn't going anywhere.
Go to Park Foundation.
Yeah, it was just in the paper this week, wasn't it, about that wind farm?
I missed it if it was, I don't know.
They're actually financing it.
Yeah, it's, now, actually, that's another interesting thing I forgot to mention. With these wind projects, the only people who get paid typically are the ones where the turbines are located. So if you're a neighbor, you don't get anything. You get the flicker, you get all that, and you don't get paid anything. But at least in their case, they did work out an arrangement with the local neighbors so that they would share in that somehow. Yes, sir.
So in all these wind and solar projects, there's no ad valorem taxes?
I don't know. We haven't run into that yet. I don't know how that works, to be honest with you. That whole ad valorem tax, that's a topic in itself.
You know, I would think that it would be more like the tax on a compressor station, which is taxed as a piece of property.
That's what it is. It's like a cell tower,
Right.
right? They have an assessment for that piece of property, that unit. But it's not based upon what's produced.
Not based on production, it's based upon the value of the property.
As far as payments, Dan, did anybody give me some dollars as far as what they were willing to offer?
$500 is less per acre. 500 was the best.
And they were going on a per acre basis. Most of the ones I've seen are 3 ways. One, either a fixed amount per turbine per year, or it'll be a percentage of the revenue generated, or it's X cents per kilowatt generated, or some combination of those 3. But of the people I've talked to who have actually signed the deals, almost exclusively they go for the fixed payment, guaranteed payment. Because they get paid whether those blades are turning or not. And I don't know what the current rates are, but back in the day it would vary between $6,000 to $10,000 a year. And I understand over on Wolf Island they're getting about $8,000 per turbine per year up there. Distributed solar, that's what Ecos Energy does now. So if you're interested in a solar project, you can't just tie these things into the main lines. They're all going for the distributed into your, where the lines have come down off the main lines and now you're into a distribution area, and they need a power purchase agreement. So you gotta have a customer at the other end, whether it's a school district or a manufacturer or something like that. Without that, you just don't have a deal. And the other thing, especially with Ecos, they will not lease the land. They've only leased land for solar project in California. It was a very unique circumstance. If they're gonna get in there, they know that they've got the perfect spot that they want. They've got the connection to get into the grid. They've got their power purchase agreement in place. They want to stay there. For them, it's worth it to buy, so they're not going to bother leasing. Now, this is where it gets interesting. With all this talk about alternative energy, and you're the guy that's in charge of Con Ed, and the wind just quit, and by the way, the sun just went down. What the hell are you going to do? The only solution they have in there, they mention the word batteries. Like, are you kidding me?
We just went through that.
I think Duracell stock is gonna go up dramatically here. So, coming back to this analysis, and let's say you're faced with this, what's the best fuel source in order to enable alternatives? Well, you can't do, this isn't gonna cut it, biomass, geothermal, solar's gone, wind is quit. Now you gotta come back up to the old basics. Coal and nuclear, if you're running those, they gotta be run at max capacity 24/7. That's what they're designed to do. Guess who our friend, the only one that can come in, and especially with combined cycle, they're the only ones that can gear up fast enough. That sun goes down, they can bring those up. Alternatives need natural gas, whether they like it or not. What's interesting about it, we've got the Con Ed plant right there, ready to go. She's running. Here's one slim ray of hope. We have 4 rural electric co-ops in New York State, and 46 municipal electrics,
Bunch of them, I don't know.
something like that, like Endicott, Green, Marathon, that sort of thing, where they all have their own systems. They're surviving because of cheap allocated hydropower. That agreement, my understanding is, expires in 2025. That's only 10 years from now. I would strongly expect the New York City crowd is going to try to come up and grab some of that allocated hydropower for themselves. I don't know if that's true. That's way above my pay grade, but if that's true, if they have to renegotiate, that might be interesting. If these guys lose that cheap hydropower, the thing that's really interesting about it is that those systems are already owned. That might be a potential candidate for local wind and solar power. It would make sense. But whether that's going to happen or not, we'll have to wait 10 years to find out.
Or a turnkey natural gas power plant.
Yep, there you go. I always finish up with this. When I was at the farm show, of course, hundreds of people would be walking by, and you'd always hear comments, especially about wind. People either love the turbines or they hate the turbines. The ones that hate the turbines, they'd walk by and they'd take a look at this and they'd stop dead in their tracks. They'd say, "Where is that? Where is that?" And I had one lady, where was she from? Norway? She traveled, I think she, in Norway. Yeah, she said, she flipped out. She said she saw this thing in Norway. Well, it turned out it's just an artist rendering. It doesn't exist. But, I don't know, I think it's kind of cool, a little different. But I think that's it. Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, Jim. A few years ago, one of the things Cuomo passed was some measures that basically allowed fast-track siting of electrical generation, power generation plants. Was that would that also help stem some of the opposition to the wind and the solar activities?
Are you talking about the PSC plan, the energy highway?
Yeah.
Is that it? Nick and I were involved with that tangentially. We were invited up to a couple of meetings in Albany, and what was very interesting was they were pushing the use of natural gas like crazy, rural, like what Leatherstocking is doing, that sort of thing. And that's where Nick and I came in there. They just wanted to hear our opinions and so forth. What was fascinating was what was going on in New York City. New York City, way ahead of the game. We were shocked. They had done a study of asthma around the entire city, and it didn't take them long to figure out. They were burning number 2 and number 4 fuel oil, and all the stuff downwind, that's where the asthma cases were. So it was a health concern. So they were pushing to get more gas pipelines in there so that they could convert over to natural gas. And there's all kinds of requirements, but we were surprised how much they had already done. They weren't just talking about it, they had already done it. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to.
No.
Okay.
No, there was something that he had passed, or it had passed, which would allow future siting efforts to basically be fast-tracked through the approval process and so forth, and minimize the amount of public input and so forth like that.
We were hearing something about it, but I'm
I'm just wondering if that was meant to be an end run around some of the opposition to this as well.
yeah, I don't know, but now they've come out with, the PSC came out with some other plan, probably as a reaction to the antis about something about more electricity, renewed, I forget what they call it, RES?
REV.
REV, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Renewable Electric Vision.
Yeah.
Renewable Energy Vision.
Yeah, which to me is kind of different, it's very different from the original energy highway concept of pushing the use of natural gas. So, I don't know anything more about that. Yeah. Anybody else?
Jim?
Yes.
Getting back to the New York City thing with the asthma and stuff, I was an engineer with the New York City Board of Education. And in the early 90s, every coal-fired plant in the Board of Education was replaced with a dual fuel system that burned gas. When it got below 30 degrees, they would switch over to number 2 oil. So they've been looking at it for 20 years.
Long time, yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.